All right, welcome everyone at the Multi-Network Community Sync. Today is September 6th. We are kicking off new month. Today I finally got into some of the action items I had from last week to kind of walk through those. And then I see Peter has some questions. Let's answer those. If you have any other questions, any other topics you want to touch over here, let's just add your items under to the agenda. The link should be in the invite to this doc, so they can follow me with me, or you want to add something. So I tried out the failure cases. So to remind, there was a question on how would we behave if we specify in the pod spec items that, for example, doesn't exist, or let's say network is not ready. So what to do with such cases? How do we report the failure? And I tested this on a volumes example. So basically, you can attach a volume to a pod spec and then attach a mount into a specific container. So basically, I try to attach a non-existing config map, and basically how this is being reported is through events. So I am planning to just follow the same code paths and same template for any and all errors for pod networking. So basically, use the Kubernetes events on the pod to, let's say, state that pod name, pod network name foo does not exist, right, or is not ready. So basically, that's what I'm thinking of doing around that one. Any questions to this? I think this is kind of straightforward. If not, then the next one is the test infra CNI. So something that I brought up last week in terms of having some sort of enablement for test continuous integration in Kubernetes upstream. And I particularly try to avoid word reference implementation, because it's not that. I don't want to create a reference implementation for this feature, because I don't think that will be possible. It will be maybe too much work. What I'm trying to assign for is, or kind of design, put it in the doc, is just to create a testable mechanism for the API, right? So that's kind of where I want to kind of define the quality of this feature. So I talked with Antonio, and basically what is happening is that there is something called kind CNI that he created to enable the testing in the kind cluster. But after talking with him, he recommended to create something of our own, some sort of simple CNI that we could have, and will be semi-independent from the main KK repository and kind as well, because I think kind has like it's another project, so we probably wouldn't want to put anything over there. So he recommended to create some sort of our own repository for inside the Kubernetes organization with the code base for this test CNI. So that's something that I'm going to write down and propose in the KEP to do something similar like this. Any questions to this piece? All right. I think Peter, you're next.
Yeah, sorry. So a couple of things, both of which I hope are quite short. So I was interested in versioning. So part of the, when we present this to the various other SIGs, one of the arguments is going to be, well, it's an alpha thing, and then we'll evolve it, and it'll make its way into beta and into core over time. However, we're making changes to the pod spec. Doesn't that cause problems immediately, where that part is impossible to back out because you can't back out change the pod spec? And I might just be misunderstanding how this works, because I don't really know, but I'm hoping somebody here does know this stuff. Comment.
anyone, because to be honest, I don't know either. This is something that I am planning to learn as we go. To be honest with you, I don't know myself. And basically, I count on the Node team, on the API team to tell us that. So yeah, that's a one unknown. I don't know how that's gonna work. I hope I saw. Maybe I will say this. The DRI work. I saw in the code that the DRI team, the DRI project has a flags, alpha flag, feature flags around the fields in some ways of the pod object spec. I would imagine we definitely would do the same. I need to, that's a fair point. I need to make sure that we add a flag, mention a flag. Let me just sometimes. But basically, I would imagine that there is some ways, there have some means to kind of guard section of the core specs where we can, guard with a feature flag and then change at will. I hope.
What's the scope of the versioning? Like the resource being versioned, or like is this like feature gates in the kubelet or CRI?
So I would imagine those would be feature flags everywhere across the board, right? So kubelet, we'll see. I'm not sure whether we're going to introduce any changes in kubelet. I think we might for the default network, but I think we will have some. So, but mainly there will be flags in KCM. Every elements component we will touch, right, will have the flags. So API server definitely would have to have pod spec changes. So feature flag there. Then the KCM, the Kube Control Manager, and probably kubelet here. So basically every place where we touch, you would have to expose that feature flag, right? If I'm not mistaken, the way the feature flag is designed in Kubernetes, there is one argument, and you provide a key value map over there, and basically we will just support a new key value map in that flag, right? So that's how it kind of implemented in Kubernetes. So it's not like I have to add to everyone a new argument. It's just I will have to right now it will be just through that map, right?
Okay. So it sounds like there is a way of doing it. We've still some plumbing to figure out exactly the details, but it's not as bad as I thought it might be.
Yeah, I hope the feature flag works for APIs as well. I saw DRA doing it. I hope that's something that can be changed. I don't know, to be honest. And let's maybe that's something that we probably can ask the API team when we're gonna go present our stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that may be one of the questions to them. In terms of alpha and those version, I think that's we'll see how we go, right? How we will have alpha v1 at this, if we wanted to get this finger crossed in December, then it will be alpha v1, and then depending on how we're gonna kind of work on this, that's we're gonna move the stages accordingly, right? Alpha, beta, and then eventually GA, just simple v1. But let's see how that goes. Maybe there, as we're gonna start playing around with this ourselves, we're gonna see there's some other changes are required. So yeah, we'll see. And there basically this boils down as well to the phasing that we want to introduce to this whole thing, right? So maybe the API team will have something to say here. They won't like that. I'm not sure. Though I talked about this with maybe not about the versioning itself, but about the phases of the cap, and that was basically the proposal from team on this. And he said that it's okay to just having a single cap and then keep updating it with things, right? So basically that's the agreed path for this. We'll see how that goes with the other 6, but here that's what I have a mandate for, kind of.
Okay.
Did that answer your question in this, Pete? I think.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's fine that we don't know the exact details of what we're going to do here. I think the key point is we've got to have some kind of approach, and it does sound like we've got the feature flag approach will stop the thing that I was a bit concerned about, which is getting pushback from people saying we don't want to put stuff in the pod spec until we're absolutely certain it's all going to be okay because we can't back it out. With a feature flag, by the sound of it, we can. So I'm happy. that sounds good. And as you say, if we talk to the relevant SIGs, we'll find out more. Okay. The other question I had, and this is really just expectations of, we've got a doc with the pod network object and so on. Do we have a timeline or expectation for when that'll be updated so we can do a final review on that?
So I was about to update you on that. So I think went through like half of the doc already. So I'm getting there. That's my kind of on top of my kind of priority list to get it sorted out. We have a day off yesterday, 2 days ago, so that's a bit shorter week. But I said I will do it by the end of the last week. I am basically trying to do that, and hopefully maybe this end of this week. We'll see. But I am around halfway through it. I am finding out some new details, but I don't think I will just write them down in the doc, and then everyone can call it out if anything. But that's basically the gist of it, right? So I'm trying to get it sorted out by end of the week.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, the reason I'm keen to have it as soon as possible is the selfish one that I've got a little bit of time. We've got a hackathon coming up. We might be doing some prototyping over here. This is an internal Microsoft thing, but it'd be good. The more we have to start with, the more interesting prototyping we can do. So if we've got the doc by the end of the week, that'd be great.
So so you can start looking at, there is this branch that I created.
Yeah,
you can start.
I've seen that, and that's great. It's not complete yet, obviously, but it's a really good start.
It's quite outdated as well, right? Because we slightly tweaked the pod network, and then the network attachment object is as well there, so it's not defined. But basically, you can free to just create PRs against this branch, and we can. I need to get it to it as well, like update the. Rebase the branch as well. So right now it's very outdated. So it's like from half a year ago, and I haven't touched it since. But I think we can start doing something over here, right, on that part to just add stuff. I think at least this can be someone's starting point on what I'm thinking, right, how this can be done.
Okay, that's good. There's a possibility if we do some prototyping, we'll have to write some of the basic code ourselves, in which case I'll just make sure I feed that back. I don't know how far we'll get on that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that.
All right. Dave, is that right, Dave?
Yeah. Hey,
all right. Hi there.
Yeah, my name's Dave. I'm part of the Knative community, and like I'll give you some context on the kind of the gateway routability. So essentially in Knative, we have a use case where, hey, we want some this one resource we have eventually trickles down and starts programming a bunch of networking resources. So for example, if you're using Istio as your networking layer, it programs virtual services. If you're using Contour, it does HTTP proxies. We're looking to adopt the Gateway API, but one of the features that it kind of lacks is this concept of what kind of we termed routability. Like, for example, I want my Knative service to only be accessible within the cluster only, is as an example. So we call that kind of like cluster local visibility, because by default, these services, Knative services, are exposed via the ingress to the public internet via like some load balancer IP. So I kind of went to the Gateway project, created like a proposal, kind of got buy-in from everyone about like some of the mechanics there. And then when I went to the SIG network for a final review, the feedback was some terms I included was like public, which kind of referred to, hey, this is going to create potentially like some public IP that's accessible on the internet. Another term was sort of like private, and that's sort of just meant to be kind of like ambiguous to be maybe sort of be like the IaaS VPN or something like that. And then like a cluster local, which was meant just to be a cluster IP effectively. So when I went to the SIG network for review, the feedback was like, hey, public and private are pretty ambiguous, and also how do you reconcile this routability with this project network? And I'm just here to kind of like get thoughts and feedback, because like so far when I skimmed what you've done so far, you seem to be addressing like pod networks. I think gateways kind of map more a little bit to like Kubernetes services type load balancer, where like you might want to get an IP on different networks via, like, for example, a load balancer IP for a VPN, load balancer IP for Amazon, public internet, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to figure out, like, it seems like you're not addressing, I would say, what I might call like service networks. Like,
yeah, so I think because I assume you going from coming from gateway, your core element will be still service, right? On the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Is that true? Yeah.
Exactly.
So from our kind of this group's discussion, we didn't get to kind of address services themselves, right? I think this is why folks are asking about it. And to give you some, because I'm not saying that we internally we did some kind of experiments or discussions on this. We didn't in this group, but we eventually will on talking about how to handle services. But maybe this is where, because you say routability global to private, one of the aspects of this is how you would treat that against the pod network, right? Because we are introducing pod network as another dimensional, trying to as another dimension of the pods, right? Today pods, one dimension for it is which namespace it is in, right? And now the next one will be on which network it is on, right? So, and basically I'm not sure whether this is specific to your add-on to the gateway, but because it will be applicable to services and then gateways themselves as well, right? How those will behave with those concepts, right? With the pod networking and all that. In your case, I'm not sure whether there is anything specific, because public versus, is there anything else on that, or just public versus private?
If you open the GEP, essentially, like, to me, public sort of maps to just when you request a type load balancer, right? And then by default, you'll get like a public IP. Maybe, oh, did I go back and open the GEP maybe?
Oh,
the first link.
Oh, because I opened the issue, yes.
I also posted the comment where Rob posted feedback from the SIG network approvers. So yeah,
That's
if you
the one,
scroll
right?
down, so like for my use case is really just cluster. But generally, like, public to me is just like, hey, I get an IP that's essentially accessible on the public internet, kind of what type load balancer sort of does now. Private is the interesting one, I think, and like where you give, like, because I know each implementation has, or I guess cloud provider has annotations that let you configure the resulting load balancer that fronts the service. So maybe like that's sort of like, I think, why private would maybe be considered like VPC only. And then for me, I just care about cluster. Like, I just want a gateway that is not accessible outside the public internet, and even maybe the private one. But I think the interesting thing here is like, okay, well, how do I make this compatible with what you're going to do in the future?
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's then like change, rather than like have routability, it's maybe just like a network, and that is then, I'm just kind of like solutioning here, right?
Right.
In order to make this work with the whatever you come up with the future, maybe it's just a reference to some Kubernetes resource and it's abstract. And
so
maybe, like, are you going to have such a thing as a service network? Or
so what at least I'm thinking, right? And basically this is something that we still need to discuss within our group. But basically what I would think is all the objects should have pod network field eventually. Maybe even added to metadata. Why not? Right? No, but just going crazy. But something like that, right? So basically service is a namespace, it's a name, and then in a spec it belongs to optionally it can be assigned to a specific network. I don't see, and that's something that we probably gonna discuss in the future, but I would not see a service belonging to multiple networks, right? I'm not sure whether that would work, right? You would have, if anything, I would imagine a network belongs just to one pod network, right? That
I
means
think I think the other perspective would be if I view it as sort of external, it's like if I'm making a service accessible on multiple networks, then I would assume I could get incoming traffic.
so, and that's the thing, right? If what I said is a service belongs to a pod network, then gateway. How do we want to position gateway? Because gateway means basically if like going into like networking terms, this is basically gateway is a router, right? So should a gateway allow me to connect to multiple pod networks at once? That's another thing to consider, right? Or should it be like service where it's, let's say, let's assuming that service belongs just to a one pod network, should the gateway be only limited to that as well, right? So basically then if we just go the simple way and let's say gateway is assigned to a specific pod network, the public private what's not is within that network, because that's what you do today anyway, right? You have a cluster connected to one network, and then I make it either the default network, which we call it out in our spec in our doc, where today's network is just default, right? And within that network, you call a gateway, are they public or private, right? Is that okay when you're going to have multiple networks and to still keep to the same concept, right? I gonna have this gateway assigned to a specific pod network, and then within that network, I define whether it's public or private. I think that they ask you to come here because you are adding infrastructure, right? We are defining some sort of a networking infrastructure as well here. I think that's why, since you introduced this one, because initially I was thinking, why you coming here, and now I see because you adding this field. I think this is looking like future-wise. I think this would get expanded by another a field called pod network, right? That this guy is this gateway will be assigned to a specific pod network. I don't think we can decide that today because that's I don't think within our group I don't think we can decide that. This is something that we probably will have to first talk with service folks and then the gateway API folks coming from us, right? On how we would assign things.
I think the other thing I would think about a use case would be, as a user, I might just say I'm using a service, and then I'm creating a route for my Kubernetes service, but then I might want to attach it to multiple gateways that technically would surface it. Like, hey, make this accessible to the public, make this accessible also to like VPN or like cluster local and just like my private network. Does that use case still fit in the kind of model?
It does when we talk within, and here you can think of networks, right? Because you think about underlying networks and because pod network represents not only it can represent, depending on the implementation, can represent different things. That unfortunately is a thing. We're trying to be kind of flexible here, but as I mentioned, it can represent it represents a network to which a handle for a network, however you define the network for your implementation, and then pod can attach to that, right? And you can reference it through a pod or anything else, right? And let's take a more simple case. Let's assume the pod network represents a VLAN in your network, in your infrastructure, right? So basically, one network, one VLAN, right? And basically, your nodes have access to all the VLANs. In that case, what does the gateway means in your situation, right? Let's assume that situation, right? So your gateway public, does it mean that I can attach to multiple pod networks and basically route between the VLANs? Does that, but that as well assumes you have routability between the VLANs in your infrastructure, because Kubernetes definitely will not enable that routability. We don't want to go there unless you, of course, create your own some sort of virtual function that will do the routability. But you see the problem here, or maybe not the problem, or maybe
Yeah,
the
I think
case, right?
I think the private one is a bit more complex, but like how, let's just go and talk about Kubernetes services. If I, in the same scenario, if I have a bunch of pods on a network, if I create a Kubernetes service type load balancer, let's say on Gkey, would that then give me a public IP?
Yeah,
But then
definitely, right? But if we were to, and I'm speculating here because as I don't want to impose on anyone, but let's give some let's put some kind of frame so that we can discuss this, right? So let's assume the service is assigned to a network, right? So my load balancer type service is advertised with a VIP from that specific network. So let's say my pod network is VLAN 100. So basically my VIP will be from VLAN 100, and it's reachable within that VLAN only, right? Unless, of course, my infrastructure allows routing and what's not. That's another aspect. But let's assume it's all isolated, right? So let's say it's limited within that specific VLAN scope, right? So basically, if I create a service, load balancer type service on a pod network VLAN 100, this is where the VIP will be broadcasted in, right? So all the pods connecting to that pod network have access to it. But if there is a routability between specific VLANs, I should be able to reach out, because it's an LB, right? So LB type service. So this is external, right? So it's like, because basically what you can treat those pod networks as separate clusters. Look at that as each network is a separate cluster within one cluster, because that's what it is basically. If you implement your networks as fully isolated, right? So basically each network is a separate cluster, and basically how do you interconnect multiple clusters? Through LB type services, right? So basically you create that LB service, and then I can reach across, right? If I have route between the VLANs, but that's what it means, right? We definitely, in that case, you would want to prevent cluster IP leaks, right? Because that LB type service will still have cluster IP. And basically, I would assume in let's say still going.
I would say it has like it has different addresses, right? Like you were
And there
saying.
is that, of course, yeah. So I'm not sure you're following. There is Antonio. Antonio is from SIG Networking, is working on something called service sider object. And basically that will define this. There will be a separate object. Today, this is all passed. The service sider is passed as a, and I'm talking about the cluster IP in this specific case, but for VIP, then that's all lies on the load balancers. But on cluster IP itself, Antonio is going to create an object which will define your service sider, and it's the one today. It's through arguments in KCM and kubelet, but there will be an object for that eventually. And then what we are thinking, I would think, is to provide a pod network to that object, right? And then I can create multiple of those service siders per each pod network. And I will have separate service siders per network. And then the cluster IP has its own ranges and what's not. And of course, then the question will be whether I isolate or not. That, of course, depends on the implementation of the pod network, right? But assuming it's still isolated, then you can, one thing you should be doing is not leaking endpoints, right? Because you should not be able to access, even if it is with the same cluster, I should not be able to access endpoints from the other guy because they are cross networks. Of course, depending on how you want to, and this is all that boils down to implementation where, okay, my networks are provide full isolation, and then then I cannot access cluster IPs from between networks, right? But that's one of the approaches. So having that in mind, how do we then treat the gateway, right? Is the gateway still just within the boundaries of that pod network? And then basically, because that's what you do today, right? And now we need to define how the gateway would behave when we have multiple pod networks, right? Today you have just one default, and you basically don't think about it because you have just one network and you work within confinement of that. What if you're gonna have multiply that, right? Do we want to define that gateway then as assigned to specific pod network and works within the confinement of that? If you want to do that, this is the easiest because this is what you do today. And the only thing what you need to provide is the insulation between the pod networks. Or do we want to do more? Is the gateway doing something more than that? And that's the probably question right now. I don't think we have an answer. I have some ideas personally, but I don't think we have an answer. I'm keep talking all the time. Anyone else has some opinions, some thoughts on this from the group? Yeah. Okay. I think that Dave. I don't think from our point, this is just, I'm trying to provide you with where we are heading so that you are aware of what we are trying to introduce. I think from the point of view, what you're doing here, you're okay. And basically, but it will be okay. It will be non-invasive if we assume that it's the isolation is in place between pod networks, right? So our service is assigned to a specific pod network, and then indirectly gateway is that as well. If we assume that, and let's say gateway cannot be shared across multiple pod networks, then basically you're all fine, right? Because then we would just add to the gateway infrastructure, we would add another field called pod network, right? And then it will be if it's not specified, it basically means it's using the default network, but when it's specified, it means it's assigned to a specific pod network.
Okay. And then do you think then that would cover the enum of routabilities that
So the enum of routabilities will be within the confinement of a specific pod network.
I see.
That's what I would imagine. But the question is that okay with you? Because you tell me. I gave you an example of pod network being a VLAN, and let's say you have that connected to your cluster. And what if that confinement of this enum is within that pod network? Is that good for what you want to do? Or are you assuming public? That means I have to be public on every network that's in the cluster, or is being confined to a specific pod network okay?
I think a more naive view because I'm not a networking expert. So like, for example, cluster to me might just imply like the default network. So I just get like just a cluster key. Private, I would just assume then it's probably like, I guess, would a VPC on like GKE or AWS map to a pod network in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's assume that. Yeah, you could do that, right? Let's assume that, right?
Yeah.
Your
pod network. So then I would associate then, in order to have private, I would have to make this extensible with what's incoming. I would then for this sort of routability enum, I would just say, oh, I need to associate this gateway with a network. So then if I wanted essentially what I would call a gateway that is exposing things to the VPC, then I would attach to a pod network that is associated
for that
with
VPC.
Yeah. And then I think the last one would be like private. So how would I do the private one? Because what
is the difference between private and public and cluster? Yeah, private and cluster. What's the difference between those two?
I think it's just sort of like the inbound routing. Like VPC, I would say I know doesn't have it'll give the load balancer an IP that is not accessible on the internet versus
Okay. So it's internal versus external, what you
Yeah.
private versus public. Okay, that's yeah, I'm familiar with that. So basically within VPC, and maybe to the group, if not someone is not familiar, in VPC, even if you connect your VMs in a specific VPCs, you can, all the IPs within the VPC are internal, right? So basically, private would mean I can access a cluster from outside a cluster, because there is that aspect, right? How do I access a service from outside a cluster with a VM? So basically, I would create a service which is basically load balancer type still, but as a private. So it gets a VIP, which is within that VPC range, right? So that will be private, and that's perfectly fine. The question here to you, Dave, is in public, you attach basically the external IP to a specific VPC and forward it to that specific VPC. Is that the goal? Is there a case where you would, for public, I would want to attach, because that's what you do today, right? A cluster is created in one single VPC, and you route traffic to that single VPC, right, from external.
Yeah.
Is there any way, the case where you would want to route to other VPCs or multiple VPCs? I'm just, because if that, yeah.
That's where like for me, no, I don't have that use case. But I'm not the person to ask because like I mentioned, I only just want the like cluster local routability. But in that mind, I would just assume, would that not be handled by like defining a network that spans multiple VPCs?
Fair point. Yeah, we could, if you could do that. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and then that will fit within the modeling that I'm thinking, where it's bound, right? Gateway and service is bound within that pod network, right? Then, and if your pod network ends up being multiple VPCs, that's up to you, of course. But yeah, yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
And then, so yeah, because I would assume you could have multiple pod networks, and then maybe this higher level structure that like merges the two, and then all I think I would need here is like a reference to that network or some way to signal like this is a thing. So I think that covers like the private case. Cluster, you could say, might be the default, and then but for the public network, does that mean cloud providers would need to create sort of like a pod network in their?
So we are covering a case where you don't have to, if you don't want to support it, if we let's say in 2 years, finger crossed, we GA the feature, right, in Kubernetes. The plan is to ensure that it's completely backward compatible. So you don't have to do anything extra. If you want to, you can leverage the feature to your advantage. But if you don't want to, you don't want to keep it as is, there will be a means where it will auto create the default network, and you're done, right? And basically that's what the only thing that you needed is the default network to be created, and then everything else is just attaching to that, right? The way it is today, right? So nothing changes from your point of view. It's just now you have a default network, which the one that you connect to is just there's an object for it, and everything that's kind of is created as you do it today, in let's say 2 years, it will be attached to that default network.
But is the default network going to be public, or is it going to be just the cluster local?
There is no that aspect of the network. The network is whatever it is. You define what it is. You cannot from Kubernetes specify that it's public or external. Basically network is, and you it's just a handle to the network. If that network is public or not, that's up to you, right? To the implementer.
But I guess, for example, how do I, and if we're like if I'm repeating the same questions, then let me know, and we can maybe just go.
No, that's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Because like with service type load balancer and cluster IP, it's sort of like that to me is analogous to this routability. So because like cluster IP to me, when you say the network, then and attaches to a default network, I then don't know, how do I specify I want like a cluster IP equivalent and also sort of this like load balancer IP equivalent, where
It's
the IPs are in theory like different. They have different reachabilities.
So that's the thing, right? When we introduce the object, it will be there for the sake of the core APIs and basically and for backward compatibility. If you don't want to, you don't have to use them and leverage those networks, right? You do still treat as just there is a Kubernetes cluster, it has some network, and that's it. And from your point of view, if you don't care about multiple of those, you don't have to, right? So you don't have to worry about, oh, do I have to create another service sider per network? Because that's by default everything. If it doesn't specify a network, it will belong to the default one, right? That's what I would imagine being where you don't have to it should be backward compatible. So whatever you do today, gateway doesn't have any pod network field in it.
Yeah.
Basically that means it belongs to the default, because that's what it is today, right? Everything that's being created today in today's Kubernetes cluster belongs to the default network.
I guess I still find the load balancer IP to be distinct, because the service sider, is that because you said Antonio was doing it, is that just for cluster IP?
Yes.
Okay, so then
So load balancer side, it's up to the load balancers how they manage the IPs, and then whether they're gonna support the multiple pod networks, and that's separate. So that's we don't control that, right? You can have either the specific cloud provider load balancers, or let's say F5, right? And they're gonna do their own stuff, and what IPs they support, it's up to the LB's implementations.
Yeah, and that's where I kind of view, like, it feels like Kubernetes services have this duality where they have like the local network and the external network.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I feel like the public ties to the external network.
Right.
And that's why I was wondering if it's going to be that external network is going to be realized in the cluster in some way. Maybe it doesn't have the siders defined or something like that, but just for the sake of like being able to say, hey, this Kubernetes service, not only am I like attaching, let's say, to the default pod network, that'll give me the cluster IP that I want. I'm also attaching to this external network, which will then potentially give me the load balancer IP that I want.
Right.
Like,
well,
that to me is like, I don't know, like for private, it makes sense, I think, because I would just change the default network, or technically cluster would be handled that, but it's the public case that is a bit interesting.
I think it still works because it's still confined within a specific VPC, as we mentioned, as you described that, right? So, and that within that, everything resolves around that specific VPC, because that's what it is today anyway, right? Your cluster is assigned to a specific VPC, and you do it within that confinement of that VPC, and basically that's the default network. If you think about it, right? You don't have the handle for it, but basically whatever you do within the confinement of the default network, pod network.
I see. Yeah, I still don't get it. I still view this extinct. Like, to me, it sounds like you're saying there is, whenever I want like a public IP, it's still part of a network.
Right, because that's what it would be, right? In a specific, and maybe it boils down on what you, and keep in mind that pod network is flexible, and it's up to the implementer of the pod networking object what basically a pod network is in their implementation, right? And the easiest will be, let's say, like what you're saying, let's say it's a VPC, right? My pod network basically equals to translates to a cloud provider's VPC, right? Let's say that, right? And then that can be one of the approaches, right? But I think this is the easiest in terms of to kind of then fit it here and then fit it with all the services and the gateways and all that. And then because I think you're treating a network as a different IPs that different this is different network. No, so that's as a whole, right? In this terms, think as a network as the whole kind of package where you have the service side IPs, the public IPs from LBs, the VPC, the pod IPs, all that
see.
is,
Okay.
let's say this is
So-
all one pod network.
So what's kind of then interesting is it kind of then seems like within a network you have different routability of different addresses. Is that-
Yes.
yeah. Okay. So in theory, then routability, this kind of maybe what you alluded to earlier, routability still makes sense, like these settings,
Yeah.
and then adding the future field potentially to have network here would be the way to change it.
Right. The confinement of which network do you mean here? Yes. Then you can just change that. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Is question to you, is the public private will work like in class, like in services? If I have a public, I have the other two one as well, or this is explicit? If I have a public, it's only public. I cannot access within cluster, or that doesn't work.
No, so the way I kind of phrase this is the scope of these gets reduced. So public has the largest scope.
Okay, includes
Private
the
has-
other ones.
Exactly. So then if you request a public address, or sorry, a gateway with public routability, I actually might end up with 3 addresses. I might get my public IP, my private IP, and then my cluster IP in my list of addresses. And then if I am trying to hit this service, I might know which IP to hit because like if I'm on the cluster, I would use the cluster IP rather than the public. I think then, like, does the pod network define these different routability for the addresses?
No.
Because
that's
Because Maciej, it's Wimmy, just quick. I think so far we have limited the address range of a pod network to a single one per family, right? I think if you want
And
to
we
do
don't
this,
even-
we have to extend that. I think not.
so we don't
Potentially?
even define those IPs, right? It's up to you.
Yes.
And you're right. Maybe that's one aspect. We define it to a single, at least for pod ranges, right? We confine it to a single range per family, per pod network. So each pod network can have 2 ranges, one per each family. So V4 and V6, right? And that's just for the IPAM for pods, right? And let's make sure that we don't limit, because pod network then. Right now, that's what we did in our cap, right? And this is where we kind of stopped. But eventually, what I would envision is eventually we have to define a pod network will have to be have a service sider, and then your load balancer will have to have their own set of range of IPs for the public IPs. Same goes for the private range as well. So basically, a pod network will have to contain all those. So this is, as you see, Dave. As we mentioned here, pod network will be a field in this object that will be trickled down to all the other objects, right? And basically, maybe your load balancer has a custom object where you define a range of IPs. That guy should have one as well. Then, to which network this range of IPs belong to? Is it default or is it specific pod network, right?
So what's funny is I initially did this proposal not at this like higher level construct for gateway routability, but had it a bit more low level, like give me an address of this scope, kind of like the way, and then that was sort of pushed back against. So because it kind of makes it seem like, based on this discussion, pod network will have potential different address siders for different things.
Like today, it's not like pod, because today default network has the same thing.
Exactly.
Today
So
cluster has service sider, has pod sider, has LB siders, right? So there's nothing changing. We just are trying to organize that and confine those probably ranges within that specific pod networks, right? It's the same
yeah,
thing.
and I think then like what this gateway stanza should be then is specify the network and specify the types of addresses I'm looking for. And I think that's maybe what like Tim was pushing back on, where it's like, hey, private and public are really ambiguous. But if you define these types of addresses in multi-sig, then the two projects would work well together.
Yeah. So one question is one aspect to this is private versus public. I'm not sure how that fits into on-prem environments. It works perfectly into cloud environments, but how does that fit into on-premise environments, right? Because I don't think there is a concept of private. So is that too much of a maybe not, maybe then private equals public there, right?
Yeah, maybe.
And there is just that, right? Any other questions?
No, I would say thanks for the discussion.
I'm not sure. I hope I did give you some explanation on where we're going, where we're heading, and what pod network is going to be. So then with that, you can have more better kind of understanding of where to go with this.
Yeah, I think my takeaway is a network will have addresses that potentially span scopes in a way, like you could have a network that's public addresses and stuff like that. And I think for me to be able to move this forward, I guess with the SIG network approvers, it would have to be like if you define the types of addresses, or even if they're arbitrary, like the pod network defines them, like, hey, these are my public addresses, like as the operator might do that, then maybe then that's the way that this GEP could move forward and then be compatible with what you're going to land in the future.
I don't think you have to worry yourself. That's the thing. That's something that we did as well, right? Because IPAM is very intricate to the platform provider, right? So, or the infrastructure admin, right? You don't want to push that onto the user here, especially when this is a gateway. Gateway is supposed to be an object that's created by the admin, not the infrastructure owner. Infrastructure provides you classes, right? Then the gateway defined by admin. Should that guy be fully aware of which CIDR is what, right? I don't think they should. They should be just classes, what you have here, private, public, and cluster, and then that should automatically in the background be resolved, right? That's my thinking.
Okay.
What did exactly Tim push back on here? He pushed back on this, or he pushed back on those the initial approach that you're saying with the IPs?
I think essentially like public and private is hard to define. Kind of like, even like you mentioned, like your on-prem example, like what does public mean there? And then the other thing was those become especially hard to define when combined with the incoming Kubernetes multi-network initiative. So it's way, like, I think to the way you describe things as classes, I wonder then if the pod network had these abstract classes that could be defined, then maybe that's what is the contract between infrastructure and the admin operator. Like, I don't know, right? Like,
yeah,
I think that's where they're just trying to connect the two, because there's these split, it seems similar. So, but yeah.
Okay.
And it might be worth, like, I don't know if it makes sense for you to maybe reach out to Tim to see if he had any other things that weren't captured in the meeting or the feedback.
All right. Yeah, I will sync probably with Rob as well. So
yeah,
so
okay,
we
great.
can thank him. Okay. Anything
Cool.
else, Dave?
No, thanks for the time.
No worries.
Yeah.
All right, we are all at the time. I think we went through most of the things. Getting back to our topics, as I said, I will try to get the refactoring done by end of the week. I will ping everyone on the Slack channel when I'm done, to let you know that I'm done, and you can start reviewing and adding stuff and what's that. All right. Any other final opens, questions? All right, then let's call it. Thanks everyone. Meet you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.